Welcome to Philosophy 3400, Ethics. Today we're going to look at Lecture 1 from Theodor Adorno's Problems of Moral Philosophy, a lecture series from the late 60s, I suppose, 67, 68, maybe 66, somewhere in that range. I want to look at the very first page, a passage in the middle of the first page. So, this is page 1. About 12 lines from the top or so. The question of the moral life is one that will be put, or so I hope, in the course of these lectures. So what does it mean to live a moral life? The form it will take will be to inquire whether the good life is a genuine possibility in the present, or whether we shall have to make do with the claim I made in that book, Minima Moralia, which we'll look at towards the end of the semester, whether we shall have to make do with the claim I made that, quote, there can be no good life within the bad one. So incidentally, I mean, that is the fundamental question Adorno asks in his ethical work here in the 20th century. That's something that comes up, of course, in Minima Moralia, as he refers to here, but also is present in the lectures from the beginning. Is it possible to live the moral life any longer? Is it possible to have a good life in the midst of what he calls the bad life? Okay, so I just want us to be clear about what his question is. Now you may be wondering, of course, what the heck we're talking about with the bad life. Well, let's continue to push through these lectures, and maybe that will begin to become clear, the lecture here, but also some of our other readings. So, bottom of page 2, Adorno anticipates a demand that he feels his students, at least some of them, would make, have been making, and that is that they want useful knowledge from his lecture series. Look, he's lecturing in the mid to late 60s in Germany. Adorno is incredibly popular at this time, perhaps the most popular, one of the most popular living philosophers, and many militant activist students have been reading Adorno for years and want him to tell them what the heck they should do in the 1960s here to challenge and fundamentally transform the system, status quo. And so they don't want to. He's anticipating that some students will be impatient, and they will want him to give them practical advice. However justifiable, Adorno writes, or rather says, this is a transcription of a lecture, bottom of page 2, however, about 10 lines from the bottom of page 2, 10 lines up. For however justifiable your interest in gaining useful knowledge from a course of lectures on moral philosophy, and as he puts it, right, it is justifiable that you should gain useful knowledge in a sense because moral philosophy necessarily has a relation to practical action. That is, even as theoretical as we want to get here and understand the history of ethics, at the end of the day, the question of what it means to live a moral life necessarily has something to do with something that we should do, whatever that may be, right? We have to do something here to live the good life. What is it? However justifiable your interest in gaining useful knowledge from a course of lectures on moral philosophy, there is nowadays, if anything even more so since Adorno's time, there is nowadays a great danger of what might be termed an illicit shortcut to practical action. And we must make clear from the outset that moral philosophy has a necessary connection, as I've just stated, with practical action. And so, yes, right, the point of learning about ethics and moral philosophy, and I'm not going to draw much of a distinction between the two, though Adorno will at the end of this lecture, but the point is, that it should change our lives, and it should inform what we do with our lives and in our lives. And yet, Adorno is drawing our attention to what he calls a great danger of an illicit shortcut to practical action. In the 1960s, this would have been the militant activist students demanding, practical advice on what to do right now. Should we strike? Should we not strike? Should we occupy the building? Should we not occupy the building? Should we defend ourselves physically from police and state violence? Or should we be nonviolent? These kinds of questions people might want to demand an answer from somebody like Adorno. He is saying from the outset he's not going to be comfortable giving these kinds of answers, and he thinks, there's a danger in the impatience to hurry up and do stuff. So, what is that danger? Let's have a look at page 3 and look at a somewhat lengthy little excerpt here from the middle of page 3. I have found, Adorno says, I have found again and again that when carrying out theoretical analyses, and theoretical analyses are essentially critical in nature, to the extent that they are theoretical, sort of leave the given data behind and they rise above whatever is immediately evident to take a sort of bird's eye view of the situation from above. So theoretical analyses are essentially critical in nature. That is, they don't presuppose that whatever facts we have at our disposal and whatever present situation we're in is somehow natural, normal, or must eternally repeat itself. So theoretical analyses are essentially critical in nature. But when I'm engaged in these analyses, Adorno writes, I have been met by the question, yes, but what shall we do? And this question has been conveyed with a certain undertone of impatience, an undertone that proclaims, now he's imagining his interlocutor again, all right, what is the point of all this theory? It goes on far too long. We do not know how we should behave in the real world. And the fact is that we have to act right away. I am not blind to the motives behind this protest, particularly in light of the atrocities perpetrated under the Nazis. So he's acknowledging, right, that the impulse to action here, we have to act right away. Why? Because there is some terrible injustice that we must do something about. And of course, Adorno and the Germans, having been through the rise of the Nazis to power, the Holocaust, genocide of the Jews, this is all still with Adorno and his audience in the 60s. This is only about 20 years removed from the end of that war. And so he understands that people are worried that something like that could happen again, for example, right? And they don't want that to happen. And so he understands the impulse here to do something, to respond, and to do something constructive and positive to change some injustice and to achieve justice. Civil rights movement in the 1960s might be the sort of textbook example of what this looks like. So we've got to do something. We've got to change something and make things better because people are being brutalized, and we can't allow that to continue happening. I am not blind to the motives behind this protest, he writes, particularly in light of all the atrocities that have been, perpetrated in Germany, but also, he says, of the difficulties of direct and effective political action in our own day. In other words, it can be quite difficult to actually build a movement, more or less, that actually leads to the kinds of change that need to happen to really put an end to injustice. In other words, a lot of times people get together, there might be demonstrations, protests, there might be something going on here, but at the end of the day, things don't really seem to change for the better, and sometimes they even get worse. So, what do we do then? Very well, he's imagining, right? He's imagining this impatient person who needs to do something now. Very well, if there are barriers everywhere, and every attempt to create a better world is blocked off, and this is sometimes a view of the Frankfurt School's political theory in the 20th century, right? Is that basically a totally administered society has co-opted and neutralized resistance to the totality in advance, in a certain sense, and this is basically the function of the culture industry and of ideology in general. We are conditioned basically to not be able to take up this theoretical critical position any longer by being saturated, for instance, with media that condition us to believe all manner of things that ultimately stand in the way of creating a more just society. So if there are all these barriers, every attempt to create a better world is blocked off. What exactly are we supposed to do? So again, this activist student that Adorno is very sensitive to is demanding, right? Something must be done. There's injustice, there's brutality happening in our name with our tax money, etc. And so, right, what do we do? And it seems like the Frankfurt School and Adorno here are saying, well, at the end of the day, it's the entire whole system that needs to be changed, and so little reforms here or there are not going to make a fundamental difference. So what do we do then? Comes the demand again. The reality, Adorno writes, is that the more uncertain practical action has become, the less we actually know what we should do. And the less we find the good life guaranteed to us, if indeed it was ever guaranteed to anyone. Incidentally, it really wasn't, in the sense of a guarantee, right? Although today we have a sort of ideology that functions to pretend as though it were, right? What is that ideology? The good life is guaranteed to you if you go to a university, earn good grades, and graduate with some major that is in demand in the job market or something, and now you have sort of life ahead of you, stable employment, dignified employment. You get to use your mind and creativity at work, hopefully, and not just manipulate things with your hands repetitively. And the idea is something like, now you are going to earn a decent living over the course of your life, buy the house, buy the cars, take the vacation, have the family, etc. And the truth here, the reality, of course, is that there are no guarantees, right? You can have a 4.0 average, receive an award for being a wonderful student. It doesn't guarantee that you will receive dignified employment, or even that you'll ultimately enjoy the work you go on to do, which, of course, is not exactly what you're doing at a university, doing that work yet. You're simply learning about some profession, perhaps obtaining skills that would be useful in some profession, but the actual doing of the profession is still in front of you, and the reality of work in some field can be quite different than the impressions you have of that at the university, unless you happen to know someone who's actually doing the work. So anyways, all these things to say, right, there is no good life guaranteed to us, even when people will pretend as though there were, right? All you have to do is earn this degree. All you have to do is hit this benchmark. All you have to do is this, that, or the other thing, and your life will be sort of set, and you won't have to worry any longer about money. This impatience, to achieve the good life seems to be slipping away, right? Less and less real for most people. Well, we could correlate this today, right, with the increasing prominence of the gig economy and unstable employment and things like this. Well, when this is happening in reality in our economy, Adorno says, you also find correlated with it, right, a greater haste in trying to snatch at the good life and try to make sure that we somehow achieve it, even though it seems to be slipping away from us. And so, in a sense, you could say, the increasing transformation of universities to job training centers for the job market that we speculate on existing several years in advance, and the increasing discourse around coming to a university simply to increase your earning power over the course of your life and whatnot. These are all ideological aspects of what he's talking about here. The idea seems to be, come here, make a rational choice, guarantee yourself a good life, and be on your way and start living that life. But the reality is much different if you actually look at the statistics critically. Now, and so in other words, though, but the idea, the point here is, the more difficult it becomes to even know what a good life might look like, or to achieve something like it, the more we actually want it, because it's no longer as real and as possible, and so the demand for it becomes even stronger because of its scarcity, right? It's just as if when you want to buy a Sony PlayStation 5, apparently right now, right? There's so much demand, there's not enough supply, and the demand becomes crazy, and people start spending ridiculous amounts of money, for instance, just to get the thing they want. And they bid against each other and whatnot. Okay, in any case, let's continue to move forward here. He's worried that this demand, this insistent question, what must we do right now? Something needs to change now. We must act. He worries that this leads to a kind of blind practical action, a doing of something for the sake of doing something, and just to put it as mildly as possible, a completely ineffective practice, ultimately. A practice that generally does not accomplish its goals, but fails to accomplish its goals, and sometimes accomplishes the opposite of what it actually intends. All right, in a situation like the present, Adorno writes on page 4, again, says at the lecture, and it is written here in the transcript, in a situation like the present, okay, and the present here in the 60s in Germany is a lot of political polarization. Does that sound familiar? In the 60s in the United States and Germany, you had a very strong split running through society between younger people who were more politically progressive and sometimes militantly activist, and older folks who were more conventional and who were very worried and threatened by this younger generation, the counterculture and the protest and the criticism coming from the young about the hypocrisy of their elders and the moral bankruptcy of their society. So in a situation like the present, I think the present in Germany, late 60s, the present in the United States in the present in the United States in the late 60s, and the present today, frankly, in the United States or Germany, there there are some interesting parallels. We kind of are in a situation not that unlike this situation from more than 50 years ago. A lot of polarization. You have a sort of resurgence of fascism, frankly, both in the late 60s in the form of these sort of conservative, so-called conservative, but in fact authoritarian kind of right-wing movements that want to sort of unleash the police on these countercultural hippies and protesters, something that does happen, for instance, at the Democratic National Convention in 1968 in Chicago and elsewhere. Okay, so in a situation like the present, where we're all kind of divided, where the young generation is really opposed to the older generation, and where, young people no longer seem interested in pursuing conventional careers and kind of doing some emulating their parents and elders, but want to create a new world, a more just world. In a situation like the present, one about which I do not entertain the slightest illusion, nor would I wish to encourage any illusions in you, whether it will be possible ever again to achieve a valid form of practice. That is, can we live the good life again? Can we live a moral life? May well depend on not demanding that every idea should immediately produce its own legitimating document, explaining its own practical use. Now he's comparing the activity of ethical theorizing and of theorizing in general, and of having ideas, and of just sitting there and reading things and thinking about them, for instance, or looking around and thinking and reading journals and newspapers. He's comparing that to being, for instance, a Jew in Nazi Germany. And then he's comparing this impulse towards putting things to practical use to the SS soldiers and the Nazis. And the idea is, when we demand of ideas that they must result in practical actions and they must ultimately prove beneficial to us in some fashion, when we do that, we actually destroy the possibility of actual theory, of genuine theory, and instead make theory subordinate to practice. That is getting things backward in Adorno's view, or at least not really respecting the kind of mutual interplay between the two. And that dooms practice, he thinks, to failure in advance. The situation that we're in, he says, may well demand instead that we resist the call of practicality with all our might in order to ruthlessly follow through an idea and its logical implications so as to see where it may lead. This is an interesting insight, one of the most politically engaged and frankly controversial thinkers of our time, Slavoj Žižek, basically, repeats this thought on a number of occasions, claiming that the most revolutionary activity today, sometimes you'll find this in his writings, is, of course, not doing something like storming a Capitol on the basis of disinformation, but to do something like what Adorno's drawing our attention to here. Can we just sit and dwell with thought and theory for a while and sort of steep ourselves in it without worrying what we're going to do with it? And if we can do that, then we are actually engaging in theory. And that's when we have the insights, perhaps, that ultimately would be translated into practical actions, but can never sort of be formulated in advance on the basis of the theory. There's always going to be a sort of spontaneous moment that theoretical speculations and ruminations can never define or articulate in advance. So what are we talking about here with a spontaneous moment that is necessary? In any case, just to touch on this briefly, page 6, the very last sentence of the top paragraph, something like a true practice is only possible when you have passed through theory. This is Adorno's belief here, and so what he's getting at here is, there is no shortcut to practical action. You must pass through theory. You must spend 5 to 10 years reading Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud, or a variety of other thinkers. You must have a theoretical approach, informed by the history of ideas. Otherwise, you're just impatient and you are demanding that something change, and you have no real understanding, he thinks, of the real forces at work there, behind the scenes, under the surface, the real causes, you might say, and instead you focus on superficial phenomena and the symptoms. Something to that effect. Okay, further down on page 6 then, theory and practice do not slot into each other neatly. Now he's going to go on to sort of, some interesting thoughts here about the relation of theory and practice. Of course, for Adorno and for many Marxists at this time, there's going to be a dialectical relationship between the two, right? It's not going to be the case that you must first start with theory and then you get to practice, and then at the end of that you have something like a theoretically informed practice. Instead, these are basically two sort of opposed things in reality, and they are in tension with each other, and that tension is a productive tension that generates sparks, so to speak, and that's just the way it is, right? Theory will inform practice, practice will inform theory, on in a sort of interplay. So let's move on, though, from that. That's really, that's more of interest if you are sort of tracking a conversation and a debate and a dispute in the history of political philosophy on the relation between theory and practice. On page 7, let's have a look here at this point that Adorno makes about spontaneity. So however inseparable, Adorno claims, these two distinct disciplines, theory and practice, may be, since after all they both have their source in life itself, they are natural to like we do things, we also observe things in general. There is one further factor necessary for practice that is not fully explicable by theory and that is very hard to isolate. This is going to be one of those moments where there's something there in reality that we are in contact with, that we can give a variety of names, we can turn into a concept, but we can never really master in terms of our conceptual edifices. We must acknowledge that this is something that our thought relates to and is in contact with, but doesn't have the ability to fully articulate in some definitive and conclusive and eternally valid proposition. What is this thing outside of thought itself, right? There is one further factor necessary for practice that we cannot explicate in theory, and that we have a really hard time isolating and sort of defining it on its own and in its own terms. I should like to emphasize it because I regard it as fundamental to a definition of the moral. We may perhaps best define it with the term spontaneity, the immediate active reaction to particular situations. Where this factor is missing, or we might also say, and so let's just think about this in terms of the last year or so, right? Spontaneity. Where has this happened? This has impelled people to get out in the streets and protest. This has impelled people to get out there and demonstrate. This spontaneity. What was it that impelled them to do that, right? And you might say, and I'm going to focus on the folks that were out there demonstrating in the streets on the basis of real information, right? Not conspiracy theories online. In this case. So what impelled people to get out there and protest against police brutality and systemic racism over the past year? Well, there was a kind of spontaneity there. In other words, right, there was a man by the name of George Floyd who was murdered by the police in broad daylight and on video. And the issue here is, that's happened before. As much as it's painful as it is to say, it's happened before many, many times on video, and certainly far more times, not on video. And it's not as though every time a black man is murdered by the police, there are people out in the streets in great numbers, as we saw this year, right? In other words, there's not a simple kind of cause and effect here where every time some incident happens, then it leads to some event, right? Every time there's a specific injustice committed against some individual, then there is mass protest against that, right? Instead, there was a feeling of this can't go on any longer, right? This was the sort of straw that has broken the back here, right? The little drop that has caused the pitcher to overflow, whatever metaphor you like to use here, right? But there's something spontaneous here. It did not, it could have been a different incident a month or two prior to that incident that could have set things off, but didn't. And then it was that incident that set things off, rather than the one that happened a week or two later. So it's George Floyd, for instance, and his murder. And then other incidents become kind of folded into it or something, but, themselves, are not the reason why the protest starts. So the murder of Floyd starts this movement, starts this demonstration in the street, and then somebody like Breonna Taylor's case comes to prominence, and it becomes part of this, right? But it's actually, there's something sort of, you can't put your finger on why on this date, in response to this incident, does this then happen, but it didn't happen in response to something else 2 months earlier that was the same, etc., right? So the idea is, there's a kind of spontaneity here. People simply won't stand for something any longer, and it's not always, obviously we don't know in advance where that line gets drawn, what crosses that line. Okay, so I'm just trying to relate this to recent events to give you a sense of how this would apply. Now, where this factor of spontaneity is missing, where theory does not wish in the last analysis to achieve anything, something like a valid practice is not possible. Okay, so where this spontaneous factor, this immediate active reaction, where we, and what is this, spontaneous factor? It's a sense of outrage, of righteous indignation. This cannot continue to happen. This is too much, too far. And you need something like that active, visceral response to injustice for there to be a valid practice. Moreover, Adorno goes on, one task of the theory of the moral is to set limits to the scope of theory itself. In other words, to show that the sphere of moral action includes something that cannot fully be described in intellectual terms, but also that should not be turned into an absolute. In other words, there's something non-conceptual here, non-theoretical. The world, something about the world we live in, something about our bodies, these feelings we have inside our bodies, feelings of outrage and indignation in the presence of injustice, feelings of compassion for other human beings, and a feeling of, they're being wronged, something wrongs us too in some fashion, and we can't let that continue. What I have in mind, he says, is something that should not be treated as if it were an absolute. So you can't turn this kind of spontaneity into a concept and an absolute in itself. You certainly can't form a set of criteria, a set of boxes that must be checked to then trigger some kind of movement for justice. It doesn't work that mechanically. So what I have in mind is something that should not be treated as if it were an absolute, but that must in fact stand in a definite relationship to theory if it is not to degenerate into mere folly. Ladies and gentlemen, I find it extraordinarily difficult to find words to describe this factor. And this is no accident, since we are attempting to describe in theoretical terms an element of morality that is actually foreign to theory. And so to describe it in theoretical terms is not without an element of absurdity. Right? And this is why, in a sense, an analysis by somebody like me of what motivates people to get out in the streets and protest police brutality and systemic injustice has an element of absurdity. Right? If you want to understand that movement, you need to watch those videos and be out there in the streets with those folks experiencing that sense of righteous indignation. And I can talk about this in terms of theory all day long, but there's a sense in which, if you're not there and part of it, you're missing something essential to that. that renders you a bit absurd, these sort of armchair political theorist from a distance, while there's actually something really happening, challenging injustice, that is related to theory ultimately. For instance, right, in these protests over the last year, related to a theory that's been articulated over the course of more than 100 years, a theory that challenges racism, and that criticizes the history of racism in this country, articulated by everybody from Frederick Douglass to Martin Luther King to so many others. Okay, now that something should be done. Here's something we all agree on, right? Beyond any kind of polarization in the 60s or today, right? Adorno's going to draw our attention to it on the bottom of page 7. And we find moments of agreement, even this past week, right? Moments of agreement between among nearly everyone across this kind of political divide in his time or our time. Let's use an example from the past week. You had both Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ted Cruz, not friends, not in the same party, on opposite sides, you might say, of our present political spectrum, agreeing. I should put this, carefully. He agreed with something she said. She then condemned him for being a fascist that almost had her murdered. Be accurate here, but nonetheless, you had people from all across the political spectrum last week agreeing that hedge fund speculators on Wall Street are villains, and that average working folks who want to invest on the stock market are deserve greater protections and deserve some help here from the government to do something about these hedge fund billionaires speculating on Wall Street. Something must be done about these folks, say pretty much the entire Republican Party and the Democratic Party, right? And so there's an example, right, that we all agree something has to be done. There are things happening that are wrong and unjust, and we should not tolerate them any longer. That something should be done, Adorno claims on the bottom of page 7, is a belief held by everyone nowadays. What is found to be problematic is when someone decides not to do anything for once, and so this is not going to work with my example here, but let's think about this, but to retreat from the dominant realm of practical activity in order to think about something essential. An example of this would be your experience here at the university. Something has to be done about your life and your future prospects. Come to a university, right? Major in something. What's problematic, right, from the perspective here of many administrators and guidance counselors and whatnot, right, is when someone decides to do something at the university that doesn't immediately translate into, say, a job, a salary, and something you can actually practically do in the world and sort of receive pay for. Let's say somebody wants to not major in business, nursing, criminal justice, etc., but instead think about something essential, let's say the history of art or sculpture in particular. You want to learn the history of sculpture. Maybe eventually you might want to sculpt too, right? But whether or not you're going to sculpt, whether you're going to learn the history, doesn't necessarily seem like something that is the dominant realm of practical activity. We don't have a lot of sculptors out there creating a lot of statues. We do not live in ancient Greece or Rome. Statues are not what they used to be now, and they're not as prominent and prevalent, really. If anything, many of them are coming down with good reason. Now, he says, what I wish to emphasize is the factor of resistance, refusing to be part of the prevailing evil, refusal that always implies resisting something stronger, and hence always contains an element of despair. So he thinks, in a sense, he's making a case here that there's something in this attitude of not entering into the dominant realm of practical activity and refusing to be a part of it, that there's something here that evidences this moment of spontaneous resistance. No, I won't. And in the history of philosophy, I think of Socrates and his remarks to the Athenian jury when he's on trial for his life, and he's asked, why, Socrates, why have you never shown up in the official political assemblies of Athens and argued for what you believe there, publicly, in front of us when we're debating matters of public policy, of war and peace. Where were you, right? Where were you then when we have these public debates and assemblies where citizens are allowed to come and speak, our version of kind of town hall in our democratic governance here, our assembly? And Socrates replies, anyone who tries to speak the truth to you in public will be killed for threatening the fundamental injustice of this society. And so what I've done, he says, is not shown up in public to debate and argue these things with you. I don't want to die. I don't want to be murdered and martyred as you're about to martyr me here in the trial. Instead, what I've done is I've talked to people privately, and I've had conversations with folks all around this community, and I've tried to change people's minds in small groups, one at a time. And he says the reason I've done this is because I know that any time you stand up to injustice publicly and refuse to become complicit in injustice, your life becomes forfeit. And then he gives examples of this from his life where he's refused to follow certain corrupt political demands, and he's refused to become part of some injustice. And he says, in those cases, I should have been killed. I would have been killed. I only escaped being killed through luck. I was fortunate not to die as a result of standing up for justice on two separate occasions when I was essentially compelled to hold public office because he lived in a direct democracy, at least for property-owning male citizens, and he thus had to perform these public functions and roles and jobs as part of his participation in his government, and he was compelled by law to. But in doing so, he refused to commit injustice, even under popular pressure. And he says, my life was forfeit at those moments. And I would have been killed. People wanted to kill me. I just narrowly escaped it through luck, or people, their tempers cooled overnight or something. They were about to kill me. They changed their mind the next day, etc. So, this has been with us all along, this decision to say, no, I'm not going to go along with something. And this refusal, Adorno says, implies resisting something stronger. In the case of Socrates, here he's an individual with a conscience, resisting the pressure of many people to do something that he doesn't feel is right, and that ultimately isn't right? History shows this, hindsight shows this. The people around him, or the authorities in charge above him, were demanding that he do something wrong, and he refused to do it. Recent examples would be people told to do something illegal by a president, right, and resigning rather than do it. Okay, so that's this kind of spontaneous moment of resistance that we can never define in advance. Let's look at Adorno's illustration of this on page 8. So he gives you an example drawn from his own experience. Perhaps I can illustrate this with something I experienced, a very simple experience, in the first few months after I returned to Germany from emigration from the United States after World War II and years after World War II. I don't think he returns to Germany until about 52, 53, 54, sometime in that time period. So it's years after. He's got to make sure Germany is safe again. I had the opportunity to make the acquaintance of one of the few crucial actors of the 20 July. You all know what that is, right? You don't need to look at that note 17 there. There was an attempt to assassinate Hitler by his subordinates, by a small conspiracy, a small group of subordinates to kill Hitler before Germany lost World War II. There were folks in Germany, folks in the military, who realized how insane and dangerous Hitler was, and that they were going to lose the war, and that they were going to be disgraced as a nation because of what Hitler was up to, and so they wanted to take him out from within. Okay, but they were caught, and some of them were executed, and apparently at least one of them survived and had a conversation with Adorno after the war. So he makes the acquaintance of one of the few crucial actors of this attempt on Hitler's life. I was able to talk to him. I said to him, quote, well, you knew very well that the conspiracy's chances of success were minimal, and you must have known that if you were caught, you had to expect a fate far more terrible than death. What made it possible for you to take action, notwithstanding these dangers? Whereupon he said to me, you all know his name, but I do not wish to name him here. There are situations that are so intolerable that one just cannot continue to put up with them, no matter what may happen, and no matter what may happen to oneself in the course of the attempt to change them. He said this without any pathos or appeal to theory, right? He didn't say I learned this by studying Immanuel Kant or anything like that. He just says, look, there are situations you just cannot be a part of and that you must resist. He was simply explaining to me what motivated him in that seemingly absurd enterprise on 20 July. I believe that this act of resistance, the fact that things may be so intolerable that you feel compelled to make the attempt to change them, regardless of the consequences for yourself, and in circumstances in which you may also predict the possible consequences for other people. This is the precise point at which the irrationality, or better, the irrational aspect of moral action is to be sought, the point at which it may be located. In other words, right, when does some sort of prominent, prevalent, systemic injustice reach a point of being completely intolerable, must be resisted? We can't exactly say, right, what it is that leads from domination being tolerated and put up with to it being resisted and deemed intolerable. Where do we draw the line? We never do in advance. We never know when this will happen. There's something spontaneous and irrational here, but at the same time necessary. There's a kind of irrationality here that rational thought cannot um, contain and grasp and understand it in its own terms. On the level of theory, Adorno claims, the officer concerned knew perfectly well how evil, how horrifying this Third Reich was. It's because of his critical and theoretical insight into the lies and the crimes that he had to deal with that he was brought to the point of action. And if he had not had this insight, if he had no knowledge of the vile evil that prevailed in Germany at the time, he would quite certainly never have been moved to that act of resistance. But now this other factor comes into play, the conviction that things cannot go on like this. I cannot allow this to happen regardless of what might happen to me or others in consequence. So it's that kind of spontaneous, irrational moment that is an essential moment of moral philosophy, and that theory will never really be able to fully unpack, analyze, and help us understand. So, because, as he puts it on page 9, then to just kind of conclude this thought, because the moral or morality involves action, it is always more than thought, right? More than just theory, more than just the consequences of a theory put to practical use. So because the moral involves action, it is always more than thought. And moral philosophy, that moral philosophy, the reflection on moral questions, stands in something of a contradiction to the object of its own reflections. What should I do? Right? What you should do sometimes is not going to be something that's immediately suggesting itself, for example, right? In a sense, that's because what you should do is more than thought, right? You can't simply sit here and just observe and then deduce some consequence, check some boxes, and then do some requisite action. Moreover, he says, there are situations, and we find ourselves in such a situation. He says then, late 60s Germany, I would say even today, we find ourselves in such a situation in which the contradiction involved in thinking about something when we should be doing something about it is especially flagrant. And I think this is part of, this contradiction is part of what impels, millions of people to get out there and demonstrate. Right? Maybe we don't know what needs to happen, but we know something has to happen to make things better. We know we cannot go on accepting the current status quo. All right. I just want to look at page 10 now, because this is actually the connecting thread to the Aristotle reading. And we're going to just do this briefly and wrap this up here, but it's on page 10 that Adorno really starts to, I think, offer some thoughts that have something to do with Aristotle. So I want us to look at this. The question of moral philosophy, Adorno claims on the top of page 10, the question of moral philosophy has become so, what is that question again? The question is, what do I do? What do you do? What do any of us do with our lives? What should we do? The question of moral philosophy has become so very problematic today. The reason why this question has become so problematic is that the substantial nature of custom, so just doing what you have been conditioned to do by your elders, by your family, by your community, just do what the older people around you do, right? They're showing you how to live. You've inherited a way of life and customs. The substantial nature of custom, in other words, custom's sort of rootedness in something sort of genuine and real among the community. The substantial nature of custom, the possibility of the good life in the forms in which the community exists, right? Traditions handed down among various groups to their young, which confront the individual in pre-existing form. And think about the United States today. You can sort of choose any one of a number of these because there are such diversity in this country, right? So what kind of community do you want to attach to? And then there are traditions there. Just follow through and carry out those traditions. The substantial nature of custom has been radically eroded by the market, by commodification, by capital, ultimately, which has reduced all of this to transactions, exchange, symbolic signification. So it's been radically eroded, and these forms have ceased to exist, whether people know it or not. They continue to live these prefabricated ways of life without realizing that these forms have ceased to substantially exist in any real fashion, have become sort of commercialized caricatures of themselves. And you can think of all these little historical downtown areas of all these little towns trying to sort of create a commodified version of what history was like 100 to 150 years ago in that area, or something like this as an example. These forms have ceased to exist. I mean, go to Sacramento, go to the Wild West little part, you'll see people out there with little pop guns and pretending to have duels and stuff like this and whatnot from the gold rush era. So obviously you can no longer live that way of life that you see sort of emulated there, and you can't rely on those kind of traditions and customs, right? And I don't think many people want to, right? Many of you are here in San State to get a career somewhere here in California or elsewhere. I don't think too many of us are really tempted by the prospect of going to some mountains or hills near Yosemite and prospecting for gold or something like this to make our fortune. Now, if we did act as though these customs, these traditional customs of traditional communities continued to have a real substantial existence that wasn't a caricature and a sort of commodification and of some original reality. If we act as if they did still exist, this will only lead to the preservation of specific spheres of life, and this has happened, in which a little of the old order still appears to have survived in a provincial form, as if it were in itself the guarantee of a good or moral life. And so the idea is, can't you just find a community of folks that seem to still be able to live something like a good life, join that community, inherit those traditions, carry those traditions out in your life, and don't you still have the possibility for a good or moral life? And of course Adorno's answer is no, you don't, but he thinks you don't, and that's precisely why so many people are so desperate to do that. Okay, finally on page 10 here, I want to look at some of of Adorno's remarks here about ethos, the Greek terminology here, the root, the etymological root of ethics. Ethos. Whence ethics, right? Ethos, the Greek noun from which we have our word ethics. Ethics being a transliteration into the Roman alphabet and into English, ultimately, of the Greek adjective formed from this noun, ethikos. So ethos, the Greek word ethos, with the long e there, the eta. Ethos, the Greek word ethos, from which the expression ethics is derived, is very difficult to translate. So difficult that everything Adorno offers us here doesn't get to the radical meaning of ethos, which I should just state from the outset, is dwelling. Okay, just like I think there's a similarity in the Latin root of habit and habitus, habitat, right? Habitat related to habits, ethos related to ethics. Ethos is a dwelling. I mean, most literally, it can be a sort of an animal's den where an animal lives. But of course, it also means these other things Adorno is going to talk about. So, in general, it is rightly rendered as nature. It refers to the way you are made, thought of as a sort of outgrowth of your dwelling, where you live, how you live in your dwelling, then is your nature. Something like this. First, the way you are made. The more recent concept of character in English, I mean, it's not a recent concept in Greek, Adorno. After all, the word character comes from an ancient Greek word. Um, and of course, the characters of Theophrastus, Aristotle's student, are wonderful. This is a wonderful work of ancient psychology. The more recent concept of character comes very close to that of ethos, and so he's suggesting character as a translation for ethos, right? Your nature, your character. And the Greek proverb, I believe this is actually a saying attributed to, or a saying or an excerpt from the work of the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus. That's what my memory is telling me here. So it's not just a general Greek proverb, but it's actually something from a pre-Socratic. The more recent concept of character comes close, very close to that of ethos, and so character is a translation choice here. And the Greek proverb ethos anthropon daimon, which character is the daimon of the human being here. Ethos is the daimon, as he puts it, or the destiny of the human being. Character is fate, is one way that's translated. Your character, sort of the character you form, the character that you form, will determine what your ultimate destiny or fate is. In other words, he says, to reduce the problem of morality to ethics is to perform a sort of conjuring trick by means of which the decisive problem of moral philosophy, namely the relation of the individual to the general. What should I do given this general situation? Here I find myself in this moment of history, in this place. Here's what's happening around me. What should I do? How do I as an individual relate to this totality I'm a part of? The relationship of the individual to the general is made to disappear, he thinks, in ethics. When you turn ethics into sort of a set of prescriptive rules, here's what I have to do, and if I do this, I'm good. I'm a good person. I've done what I need to do. I've done my part. Good life is now mine, or something like this. What is implied in all this is the idea that if I live in accordance with my own ethos, my own nature, or if to use the fine phrase of our own time, I realize myself and fulfill my potential, then this will be enough to bring about the good life, right? So just do good, get good grades in school, impress your teachers, and get a nice letter of recommendation, and you're set. Something like that, right? Win friends and influence people. This is nothing, Adorno writes, nothing but pure illusion and ideology. An ideology, he says, that goes hand in hand with the second one, namely the illusion that culture and the adaptation of the individual to culture brings about the refinement and self-cultivation of the individual. Of course, Adorno here, right, as he puts it, he's going to take the opposite approach, following Sigmund Freud's Civilization and its discontents, right? He says, whereas culture stands opposed to moral philosophy and is actually open to criticism from that quarter. So let's think about, an example of this. How does culture stand opposed to moral philosophy? Well, a big part of traditional cultures has been the transmission of racism throughout history. People learn to be racist from their family members that are older, from people in their community, and this is part of the culture, right, in various places. Moral philosophy is opposed to that, right? Moral philosophy does not start by accepting these assumptions and stereotypes, but instead questions and criticizes them. You can go all the way back to Plato's Theaetetus, and the digression in the middle of that dialogue to find Socrates, for example, opposing the racism and the classism of his culture, practicing moral philosophy for us, right there in the digression of Plato's Theaetetus. For all these reasons, he says, Adorno, here at the end of Lecture 1, I believe it is better to retain the concept of morality critically, right? To recognize that it's hard to actually live the good life for all the ethical theory we have, than to soften up and obscure its problematic nature from the outset by replacing it with the sentimental concept of ethics. but I think I need to spell out these last ideas more precisely. And so he's going to go on to do that in the course of his lectures. We're going to, of course, look at these on occasion throughout the semester. Just want to get all this on the table. I've gone on far too long already, so let's end this lecture now. Thank you for joining.